Well, welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I know some of you are up very late in the evening and some of you are up very early in the morning. So thank you all for being with us. Today's webcast in our series is around shared services and global business services and this whole issue of moving from a cost reducer reputation to a value creator reputation. So welcome. I'm very, very pleased to welcome Steve Fox, who has participated in and led 3 major shared services GBS initiatives in different global companies, the most recent of which was at Thermo Fisher Scientific. So welcome, Steve.
Thank you very much.
And I'm Dan French. For those of you who don't know me, I'm founder and CEO at Consider Solutions. I know many of you, and indeed many of you are clients of ours, so thank you for joining us. So these are the 2 folks you have with you today. Our topics for the day, we're going to run close to an hour today. This is a really important set of topics. It's coming up, it's resonating a lot in discussions we're having with shared services and GBS leaders and finance leaders and even CIOs and CPOs. So I've made a brief introduction. I want to talk a little bit about shared services, GBS and digital transformation because we cannot have this conversation without that. It's a critical enabler. I'm going to talk a little bit about this whole view of cost reduction to value creation, what it means and why people are starting to get fixated by it. And then I'm going to ask Steve to talk about his experiences, not just at Thermo Fisher Scientific, but his other experiences and see how his approach has changed and there's some valuable lessons there. Then we'll talk a little bit about what this value game is all about and how we can think about it, give you some thoughts for the road ahead and have a Q&A. So with that in mind, please do ask questions as we go through. On your panel, the interface in front of you in GoToWebinar, there's a Q&A panel. Please ask questions as they come up, as you think about them. We will collate them and we'll endeavor to answer them at the end. But those who don't have time to answer today, we will respond directly to you. So just if they come up, ask the question. If it's resolved later in the webcast, that's fine, but get it while it's hot. Equally, if you have any technical issues, please use the same interface and one of our team will endeavor to help you out. So that's that. So for those of you who don't know, Consider Solutions, this is our perspective on the world, and this is not a commercial, it's more of a point of understanding our view of the world and why we're coming to this discussion. You know, we are kind of helping organizations on this road to world-class finance, this aspirational view of helping drive better business results, reduce the cost of finance, optimize cash flow and have better risk management. And the pillars on the right in this kind of Greek temple thing are kind of the ways in which we help people with that. On the right hand side, we look at process transformation, and that's really the topic of today. So it gives you a sense of our focus in this area. And if you hear anything intelligent from me, I mean, clearly you'll hear a lot of intelligent things from Steve, but if you hear anything intelligent from me, it probably isn't from me, it's probably from one of the clients around the world that influence us, and these are just a selection of them. So you recognize some of those brands. So we're very fortunate to get into kind of healthy debates with these folks and learn a lot and hopefully develop some best practice as a result. So before we get into too much, before we get into the real meat of it, I'd like to just get some context. We've got 4 polls as we go through. This is a simple one, keeps you awake, and it should be the simplest of all. What's your role? What's your primary role? How would you primarily define your role? So obviously you could be in 2 or 3 of these, but please give us what you primarily define yourself. Are you shared services or global business services? 2, are you regard yourself for primarily finance? 3, primarily IT or IS? 4, some other business function? 5, a consultant or advisor? Shouldn't take 10 seconds. It shouldn't take 5 seconds. It should be pretty obvious. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's have a quick look at what we got. And well, that's good news. So 3/4 of you are associated with shared services and GBS, which is a good thing. But it's interesting, you know, reasonable percentage of consultants, advisors. Yeah, actually, I'm surprised there's no other business functions here because some of these topics of from cost to value don't just relate to shared services, of course, they relate to a lot of other business functions. But that's really helpful, so thank you. So let's talk a little bit about journey so far. We, you know, one way or another, we've all been on part of this journey. Either you've been on through the 3 decades or just in the last decade, but we've moved to this single process shared service center, the centralization, transaction headcount focused, through to an outsourcing, you know, India plus model. And the last decade has really seen some focus already on value in terms of global process ownership as a concept emerging, the idea of process and center of excellence matrix, you know, how do we manage both issues, and integrating multifunction, multi-source, multi-location GBS models. And throughout all of this, our productivity benchmarks have steadily improved. And that obviously directly relates to a cost, a reduction in cost per unit. So yeah, we've done well on the productivity benchmarking and the cost strategy so far. But many organizations are realizing they're on a diminishing curve now. And that's part of the story. But of course, you can't even enter this conversation without a discussion about, well, how's digital affecting it? Isn't that going to change the game? Robotics, AI, and the rest. And if you talk to your executive team, they're getting kind of presented with ideas from business schools and the leading management consultancies about what they should consider. And quite often the question is to look at the digital natives. And there's a whole bunch of companies here. The ones at the top are certainly digital natives. The ones at the bottom may be those who are moving into digital with great impressive results. Now, this is an hour's conversation in itself, but I want to pick out two key things here. One is, if you look at Uber and Airbnb as an example, as businesses, they have no assets, they generate enormous amounts of cash, they're massively successful, and they are driving a lot of business. And neither of them are doing that fundamentally through sophisticated technology. They're doing it through consumer intimacy and convenience, being more convenient, more intimate than the alternative options, and by focusing on the consumer and not the economic customer, which is a real interesting nuance in how most of us have developed in our careers. If you look at Netflix, for example, great example. I'm sure most of us are Netflix subscribers. I think every month I pay an amount of money to Netflix. I don't even know what it is. I'm an economic customer. Well, I don't even really care what the amount is because it's not a lot. I know that. But Netflix care, I don't get any communication from Netflix at all, but they care much more about the consumers of the service than they do about the economic customer. So there are 5 consumers in my household, from an 11-year-old boy, 16-year-old girl, 19-year-old boy. You can imagine the differences in taste they might have on Netflix, but Netflix understand that intimately. What's interesting for us as businesses is to remember this is about the consumer and the experience and the intimacy. The economic customer is becoming almost secondary. I'll leave you to think about that because it affects all of our businesses. Now, you take that whole model and think about the transformation and the digital imperative, and you'll realize where I'm going with this, in that this example here, that the picture on the left is Escher's Impossible Waterfall. If you look at it, it gives you mind gymnastics. But this idea about when we're transforming, we talk about this word very easily, very loosely, and transformation really means something substantial, something metamorphic, a bit of a metamorphosis. So the process on the right is a process for Uber. And we'll talk a little bit about Uber already, but when Uber move into a new city, they acquire service providers, which are the folks that drive the cars. So they sign them up and they acquire customers, but their first customer, actually people who are already Uber subscribers, they come into the city, they open up the app, they locate the customer, you say where you want to go, they propose a service, and then when you say, yeah, that's what I want to do, they will select the service provider and they will commit the service provider for you. And they do it before they commit you, which is a really interesting change because that's not normally how we operate. You don't normally commit your supplier before you commit your customer. Admittedly, it's a matter of fractions of a second, but that's what they do. And then they commit and charge the customer. They commit and charge us. Now, that in itself is an amazing thing because that means they have days sales outstanding of 0. So imagine being at a business where nobody has to talk about DSO anymore. It's just 0. So you get paid on the day you deliver the service. And then the next piece, which is really interesting, is paying the service provider. Uber drivers get paid within 7 days of the service they deliver. And they get paid different percentages of the ride fee depending on their quality and their ratings and how long they've been doing it. But what's interesting is that the drivers say, I get paid in 7 days by Uber. Most big companies don't pay for 30 or 45 days. So that's great news. So if they're happy with the fees, they get great cash flow. So this is amazing. So the customer is happy because it's intimate and convenient. Uber's happy because they've got a day's sales outstanding of 0. They get paid immediately. And their suppliers are happy because they get paid within 7 days. And this process, as you look at it, it isn't an order to cash process. It's an integrated order to cash and purchase to pay process. That's a really interesting form of transformation. And you know what? Technology hasn't got anything to do with that much. I mean, technology enables it, but the rethinking of the process is a critical element. And I come back to this time and time again. When we talk about transformation, we've got to think about the process and then work out how to automate it. So I'm not suggesting we all do this in our own businesses, but it's worth thinking about as a metaphor for transformation and also as what's possible. So we ran a series of workshops with leaders of shared services and GBS functions or GBS units. And we've probably been through about 45, 50 leaders so far. So it's not a statistically significant sample yet, but it's very noticeable. We do them about 8 or 9 at a time. And what we asked them was, what do your executives demand on your function? What do they demand of you as a leader in shared services or global business services? And they put up, it's a whiteboard session, it's not multiple choice. So they say, well, direct cost reduction, clearly, want lower costs, so that's reduce FTE, standardization, all that good stuff. And then secondly, well, it want to improve the business unit experience, want to make finance and corporate functions easier, make buying easier, and have some value in the business unit. And obviously, centralization and standardization gives us enhanced risk management, control, and compliance. That's good. We expect to have flawless issue resolution because we've got a common big center of excellence. And the interesting point, there's also expectation to preserve process knowledge that was in the business and now is in shared services GBS. But there's nothing there that's a massive shocker. You'd kind of agree with that, I think. But then the next question was, well, that's what's demanded of you. But what is it you desire? What's your aspiration as a leader of how you want your shared services, global business services organization to have? What do you want to see as outcomes? And the number one issue here, and this is what really stimulated and sparked this session off, is they want an enhanced reputation as a value creator as well as cost reducer. And the rationale for that is we can't keep cost reducing our way to success because at some point we run out of road. There's a law of diminishing returns, and despite technology, there is, we cannot just sell on that basis. We have to have an ability to create value for the enterprise as a whole, not just be a low-cost service provider that could be outsourced or not. So this is a really interesting topic, keeps coming up. The other points almost are enablers. So a center of excellence with expertise to optimize and automate as well as operate. So it's not just a service provider, we want to optimize and automate, we want to kind of make things better. That's a value thing. End-to-end business process collaboration. This started out as end-to-end business process ownership, and there's lots of debates at each of these sessions whether or not we actually own the process or not, because it's across organization, it's beyond the scope of shared services and GBS. So we ended up sort of saying, okay, let's just call it process collaboration. Some people talk about process leadership, process ownership, but you get the point. An end-to-end process focus. And then the fourth is becoming a talent pipeline for the entire business. So at the point at which you start finding that your folks are being poached for senior positions in business units, you should be delighted, because that shows that shared services and GBS is becoming aspirational for the rest of the business as well. But yeah, these are interesting, and these are feedback which, as I say, they weren't multiple choice, they just offered. So I think this is interesting stuff. So what we did then was we said, so what are the levers that you can apply as a leader to achieve success, either in the outcomes that executives demand from you or the outcomes that you aspire to? And this is the numbers don't matter, except I'm going to use them on the next slide, but this wasn't in any priority sequence. This is just in the order in which they came up. So basically, we talk about low-cost sourcing, obviously is a big, one big lever. Simplification and standardization, one of the classic cases for shared services. End-to-end process enablement, ownership, that discussion. So it came up, the third thing down on the list of things brought up. And then automation. The first thing that came up actually was having a framework to assess processes and tasks for automation. Because I think a lot of people have had a lot of experience now with the new forms of automation, RPA, for example, and realizing the challenge is also choosing the right things to automate. And you've got to choose them before you do them. So I guess that's why it's number 4. Automation itself, and again, it started off being robotics, RPA, but then people said, no, it's ERP as well. ERP is not going away anytime soon. And then the process suites, the cloud apps. So, okay, so all of that, talent and skills. Business partnering is a big one, about how do we have the skills to focus on our internal customer and obviously focus on their customer, what's demanded of them, how to engage with them, how to drive interest and value. But we're not just a service provider. We don't just listen and do what we're told, we have to listen but guide. So I thought that was interesting. So business partnering is a big push here. And then the idea of having data to help drive those discussions and drive better decisions and better outcomes. So analytics of some form. And then you see the others, staff engagement, executive support and understanding, and organization. So kind of those look like sensible levers. Obviously, a lot of those are related to each other. So we clustered the, well, what we first did is we asked them to score these. And they scored individual, and then we clustered them because some are closely related. So in here, you see what came out. And the numbers relate to the numbers on the previous slide. But I certainly expected the number one to be the automation stream, simplification, standardization, automation assessment, and automation itself. But it came out second every time. And it's really interesting why. It's because as the debate raged, and it was a debate, people realized, and particularly from experience, that you can't just leap into automation. You've got to know what it is you're automating. And this idea of having end-to-end process focus, not just within shared services and GBS, but deep into the business and right out to the customer and right out to the supplier, right out to business partners. So this number one thing about all of the tools enabling us to do business partnering, end-to-end process ownership, process enablement, and the data to drive that became the number one outcome, which is kind of interesting. Now you could argue that C and D look a little bit light, to be honest, and maybe it's because the rage of the debate on A and B just diverted people, but you get the point, right? This is kind of critical stuff. And then you look at this whole discussion about end-to-end process and business partnering, you start to understand why it's so important. We look at one process, whether it's source to pay, purchase to pay, or you look at the revenue cycle. These are long, complex chains that cut across all sorts of stakeholders, all sorts of functions, and that's why it's hard. So we've got to be able to connect those better, and we can only do that by better collaboration and better thinking. So one little question for you before we move on. If you look at your own current shared services or global business services reputation, would you say you are one, perceived as, so this is not what you want to be, this is what you're currently perceived as. Are you one, perceived as a low-cost provider, two, perceived as a standard service provider, three, perceived as a center of business expertise, four, as a business value creator, or five, as a transformation enabler? So have a think about that. Take 5-10 seconds over it. You know, obviously there's some nuances in there. We're trying to get general trends here. So low-cost provider, standard service provider, center of business expertise, business value creator, or transformation enabler. 5 seconds, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's have a look at what you say. Okay, so the biggest, so nearly half of you are regarded as standard service provider. You know, I think that's reasonable. And 20% of you are a low-cost provider. I get that. That is our perception, and we want to change these things. Center of business expertise is great, and a small number of you already view yourself as transformation enablers, which is probably why you got the time to be on this webcast, because you've solved all the problems. Anyway, that's really helpful. So thank you for that. So with no further ado, I do want to introduce you now to Steve Fox. As I said earlier, Steve has participated in and led 3 major global business services and shared services organizations. He's learned a lot along the way. He looks a lot younger than he must be, clearly. He lives in Southern California, which has probably got something to do with it. And here from the beach is Steve. So welcome, Steve.
Very good. Thank you, Dan. And yeah, just to clarify, not quite to the beach yet. I've got about another 10 hours before I hit the water. But it's something to look forward to. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody. I appreciate the time, Dan, from you, and the opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about my story. And I've sat on both sides of these calls over the last, close to 30 years and kind of 25 years in the shared service and global business services space. And the things I always found the most valuable to me were the lessons people learned and the things that people did wrong and how they course corrected. I know a lot of times people love to get up and talk about all the successes and everything that went just right and perfect. And boy, I nailed this thing, right? And I like to think over the course of my career, I've done some of that. But I personally don't think that's where the value is as far as sharing a story and listening to a story. So I'm going to talk a lot about the things that didn't quite go right. So as we talk about kind of the 3 things I'm going to cover off, I'll get a little bit, just a couple minutes of my background. just to kind of maybe in your eyes legitimize myself a little bit. And then I'm going to spend some time talking about our global process ownership experience and kind of how we approach GPOs, what we did well, what we didn't do so well, and then share a little bit around how the organizations I've led have kind of evolved into this idea of global business services. And we very much followed, the kind of evolution that Dan mentioned earlier, looking at really being transaction oriented, cost reduction oriented, to really much more of a value creator. So, and then a big part of it is exporting talent. It's always a big part of the kind of success guide for me. So, just a little bit about my background. I've been in the shared service space since 93, so really the last 25, 26 years, and that was with setting up a greenfield operation in Scottsdale, Arizona. And so, as I was thinking through this talk a little bit from that point in time to really now, I've had the opportunity to set up 13 centers really across 3 organizations, as Dan mentioned, but set up 13 centers really across the globe in that 25, 26 years. So, you think about it, I was doing one of those about every 2 years, and it's kind of like, right when you get one set up and going, you're ready for the next one. And you can see the places or the spaces that kind of played right relative to technologies, and then really across all the classic shared service center process functions and P2PO to CR&R, and then hire to retire, I own payroll and HR functions, and Workday implementations, et cetera, over the years. So, but what I'm really going to focus quite a bit of, kind of, especially the GPO portion of my presentation, is around the experience with Thermo Fisher Scientific over about an 8-year period, and we did a lot of brownfield and then a couple greenfield operations there, and building up to a pretty, for a company our size, a pretty significant organization in the GBS space with about 600 colleagues globally. So that's just a little bit about my background and where I've been. So just some of the things early on in my career, and this is the kind of the early days of shared service and early transaction oriented, processing payables, right, or collecting or cash application, or maybe some, back in the 90s, maybe if you're lucky, you were doing some GL accounting, right, some month-end close stuff. But some of the things that I learned early on was that it's table stakes to do these kind of things. You needed executive commitment, right? And I think in a lot of organizations, and I know for me specifically, when I got that executive commitment, kind of that remit to go forward, right? I felt really good about it. And I was like, okay, now, hey, I own this. This is me. Everybody kind of get in line and let's go do this. And you don't always have that. And what I've learned over the years, right, is that executive commitment can really be kind of a false sense of security. You really have to lean on your ability to influence. Definitely have to collaborate and partner with your stakeholders. And if you're lucky, right, if you're really lucky, you get most people to kind of line up and nod their head and let's take this for the team and go forward. But in many cases, that's not the case. Dan talked about cost reduction, right? I mean, initially, especially if you're in a decentralized, highly manual, paper-intensive process with antiquated systems, right? Hitting a cost target typically is not that hard the first year, the first couple of years. You build it into a business case, and it's almost, it should be, if it's not an expectation that you hit this at the very least, and most of the time you're beating it and blasting it out of the water. And so over the course of my experience here, one of the things I've really become more focused on, and really a lot of our KPIs have been driven not around, the productivity and the throughput, even though that's super important, right? That has to happen. But my KPIs evolved into really becoming much more defect focused. And what didn't go right? Why didn't things happen the way they should? And fixing those. And then the last point around process standardization, right, is that, again, we talk about it all the time, and it becomes synonymous with shared services and global business services, but it is arguably, I think, day in and day out, the hardest thing I've had to deal with and work through. So early days, early lessons, those are things that resonated with me and that I kind of continue to keep in the back of my mind as I initiate new new projects and new engagements. So then, we get into this idea of global business ownership, and it was something that I've always kind of had in the back of my mind. And as we rolled out, kind of got a broader remit in the Thermo Fisher Scientific organization to go do global business services, we really started to embrace this idea of a GPO. Our organization, we've got people, lots of people are involved. We have lots of stakeholders kind of touching the process or having a say or thinking they should have a say in how things happen. Definitely a global process as we were setting up our regional centers across the world. We had a very complex system landscape. Thermo Fisher grew a lot by acquisition. Wasn't super focused on integrating system-wise. It's just the culture and the model that we employed. So we had a pretty significant proliferation of ERPs. At last count, we had about 100 ERPs in place, from very sophisticated, the Oracles and the SAPs, to very, very routine, mundane, kind of the basics. QuickBooks is actually some businesses were running on QuickBooks. And then as kind of the imagery on the right here with the arrow is there's always an expectation to do it better, faster, and more efficient. So needless to say, our GPOs had a significant task in front of them to start to drive some process consistency and really drive standardization. And so as we looked at this and embraced the GPO approach, right? Some of the things that were really positive in the businesses and our key stakeholders really embraced was that they knew who to go to, right? If there was a P2P issue, for our North America center, which is where we started in San Jose, Costa Rica, they knew who to go to. They knew who to talk to. They had a voice. There was a face for that. We put in, like any of us would do, we put in some pretty routine KPIs, and then really tried to drive policy consistency. And our GPOs initially, and I'll say even more than initially, our GPOs really thought their core role was transitioning activities to our center. And that was, they finish a transition from one business unit, pop it into our center in San Jose, and then they're off to the next transition. And I think, from a startup and a setup perspective and engagement with the business, that worked okay to begin with, but that was not the role that the GPO needed to solely be involved with and drive. And we learned that arguably the hard way as we move forward into much more of an operational mode. As far as the reporting structure, so we had GPOs that reporting corporately. There was definitely some hand holding with the center, with the site leader at our centers and the functional leaders at our centers, which we had set up by workflows. For example, P2P, O2C, R2R. They had functional site leaders, and we had a senior director that really functioned as the general manager, if you will, for that site. But our GPOs were much more focused on dealing with their corporate bosses and with our key stakeholders as we're transitioning work in. And the connection with the center, although it was there, it wasn't nearly as tight as it needed to be. And we would have significant issues, and it's not when things are going well, right? It's obviously when metrics aren't being hit, when DSOs aren't being hit. When there's an AP backlog, I mean, you guys know the drill. When close gets delayed by a day, right? We're talking about big things here. Where then, there was a lot of fingers being pointed at the operational leaders in the center, and the GPOs were kind of had their hands up in the air and saying, hey, you've got to talk to the center. And so it didn't embody that idea of partnership and collaboration, even within kind of the structure of the shared service center organization and what we were all trying to do together. So what we did to correct some of that, kind of course correct as we went, is we did put in a matrix reporting relationship with our GPOs. They continued to report corporately, so they had that input, and we're always connected to our corporate leadership. But also we had them matrixed into our site leaders, so they could help drive issue resolution and really be not just the voice for the transition and the project, but also be much more of the voice for the center, for the operations moving forward. We totally revised. We sat down with the GPOs, we sat down with the site leaders and the function leaders, and redrafted job descriptions and really put a lot more detail and a lot more specifics around that. And that really drove, when we did that, it highlighted very clearly, right, that this was being viewed and was functioning as a transitional role versus a true global process ownership role. And then the last thing we did that really helped drive some more accountability, but also drive this strong sense of partnership was we put our operational leaders, we gave them a piece of our MBR and our QBR, which are monthly business reviews and our quarterly business reviews. We had the operational leaders own a part of that. So they were seen as, the face and the voice for some of this, and it was done in conjunction with the GPO. So it was much more of a partnership versus a kind of a one-way conversation from the GPO's perspective. As we move on, one of the things I want to kind of highlight here, you see the imagery in the bottom is, a lot of times we focus, and I've done this my whole career, right? Focus on KPIs, and the numbers are going to drive the activities, and they're going to drive the focus for our teams. And what I've learned over the years is the way I look at KPIs now, it's kind of like you're driving your car down the street, right? And a light comes on, and the little sweat builds up probably on the back of your neck, and then be like, okay, what's this all about? And the light comes on, and unless you are a mechanic or know a lot about cars, I mean, if you're like me, that light comes on, and you're like, okay, I have no idea what I do now. Do I pull this thing over? Do I stop? I don't know what the issue is. I look at that as the KPI, is that when you have those red lights, when you have those trends that are going in the wrong direction, that's just that's clearly you're kind of looking back. Something's gone wrong already. And so the idea here is that we really need our GPOs and our site leaders and functional leaders to be focused on is knowing much more about the process, much more about what happens upstream. Being able to not just say, hey, there's a light on, right? Because probably by the time that light comes on, especially in the businesses, some of them may already know there's a light on. It's how are we going to fix this? Where do we go upstream to correct this? And this really starts to talk to another part of the items I want to emphasize today is really around the skill set, the talent that we looked for in our GPOs, and that ultimately we had to kind of extract out of them because they sometimes didn't know they had it within them. But it's really to collaborate and partner. And as I mentioned earlier, be defect driven, because once you can understand, once you start measuring defects versus measuring everything that goes right through the system, you can start to fix those things. And if your organizations are anything like the ones I've worked in, typically, right, GBS or shared service centers, standing at the end of this kind of long, stream of activity and deal with all the junk that falls out, right? And so to the degree that you can go upstream, identify the defects, try to fix them up front, kind of goes without saying. It requires a lot of partnering, requires the ability to influence. It really talks to this idea, that Dan mentioned earlier, is moving away from this idea of controlling and being the controlling the process because you've got the executive remit, and really being a collaborator and a partner, and influencing the ability to change things and make things work well as we move forward. So I think the last bullet point there on performance management versus knowing the process and being inside of it is really important. I'm going to talk just a few minutes here on kind of the whole GBS setup and how it has kind of evolved in my career. Because I started like I'm sure many of us, right, looking at payables and receivables and credit management and order release, etc. Very transaction oriented, and just really focused on in some cases a very small but albeit a very important part of the overall process, and really just owning that. And you had your boundaries, right? You had your start and your stop, and whatever happened ahead of you wasn't super important because they owned it and it might affect you, but your influence and your ability to control that was limited, because we were always so focused on just our piece of the pie, our piece of the transaction process. And so as I really became much more defect oriented and looking at, okay, here's why this isn't working for us, or here's why we're not able to hit our KPIs, inevitably you move upstream, right? Whether it's into the commercial organization about price lists for customers or order entry, or you look at in the procure-to-pay space, you're going upstream to how POs are created or requisitions are created, what the approval process there is. There's price lists there, of course, as well, how receiving gets done. As you start to look at defects and drive upstream, then it gives you the ability, I think quite naturally actually, to influence. And it starts soft, right? It's like, hey, we've got this issue. This kind of affects us here. It starts soft, and it starts with much more of a question and the approach of, how can we help fix this, versus, hey, versus I'll call it kind of that classic blame game. Is, hey, you're doing something up here that's really hurting me down here, so you need to go fix it. Well, that usually doesn't play too well in most places. So that was really a key. I'll say kind of a key learning and a key, think of it kind of a cultural shift, if you will, or a mindset shift in how we approach the process, and really changing this from a throughput exercise to a exercise on understanding and rectifying defects. And as far as our structure, I mentioned earlier we had regional shared service center site leaders set up. We had GPOs that were part of that. Within each center, we had some business process improvement resources that really, were there to help us. And I'm not talking about a lot of people, right? I mean, and this didn't just happen day one. This evolved over time, where we're like, hey, we have defects. We need to go fix these things. In order to do that, we need people that are skilled in the ability to map and understand processes and really collaborate with other key stakeholders. And so, we got, I made the case to have one, right? And then, one becomes two. And then we ended up ultimately with just three, one across each major process function. So that really helped. Again, didn't happen day one. Arguably, it was like month 18 is really where that started. And I'll tell you the last thing, that it was a massive lesson learned for me, and that is around stakeholder management. And there's a number of very specific examples I could cite, but as we initiated a pretty broad effort in our San Jose, Costa Rica site, we were not good at managing stakeholders. We were horrendous, actually. We really thought, the corporate remit gave us the ability to go, kind of tell them what we wanted to tell them, do what we wanted to do, to a degree, right? I mean, we weren't crazy about this, but we just didn't have the stakeholder at kind of the front of our mind and the forefront of our activities, and that had to change. And we learned that, that got highlighted very, very quickly. So, you can see some of the things we did here as far as, expectation setting and setting up a routine cadence. And we really let the business and the stakeholder drive the cadence. Some wanted to meet every week. Some wanted to meet, 3 times a week on certain topics like DSO, for example. And then we really partnered with them pretty strongly on establishing, improvement plans and annual strategic objectives. So that partnership, again, isn't something that happened day one. It happened over time, and trust and performance and delivering on some results, albeit it's sometimes very, very small improvements. That's how those partnerships really started to tighten up. And then this takes us to the conversation on a little bit around talent and how we approached on the bad side initially, and then ultimately trying to course correct here, how we approached our talent acquisition, especially in our greenfield sites, right? Is that we knew as we we're trying to evolve to a value creator, that we can't go out and just get the base talent in the marketplace and get kind of just the basics, somebody who has some payables experience or order to cash experience. We need to grab people that will really game changers, if you will, from their ability to influence, right? And so you can go out and get transactional experts, right? Or in a lot of cases, you create them in your organization. But the ability to influence, the ability to collaborate and partner, we learned, again, fairly quickly in our San Jose organization. That's where we needed to look for our talent. We need to get those skill sets in place. And we made mistakes, right? We absolutely made mistakes, and it cost us a reputation for a while, and definitely cost us performance for at least a year in the order to cash space. We followed the business case guidelines, and we let the business case dictate kind of who we hired because of the cost, right? I really approach that as you can pay me now on that, or you can pay me later. And if you pay me later, know that you've also lost time. And we did that. We were a victim of that approach and philosophy. So, one thing I kind of want to note here is that saying yes feels good to say yes, right? And by the way, I love saying yes. I love saying yes to everybody, right? But I'll tell you, right? There's sometimes where I would argue you're more respected both internally and externally by saying no, and saying or not now, right? So again, very important lesson for me to learn that there's a prioritization you have to go through here. So just to wrap up, I think I talked a little bit about to me what success looks like on the GPO side and on the talent side, as well as managing stakeholders. There is this we talk about this golden skill set, but it's really around being a collaborator and having leaders that have the ability to influence and partner. And that's really, really important as you try to make your path here and learn obviously from your mistakes and really moving from this idea of controlling and owning to influencing and partnering. And what I found over the course of my career, that's really what drives real value creation and real respect within the organization. So with that, I'll turn it back to Dan, and I appreciate the time and the opportunity to share a little bit of my story.
Thanks, Steve. There's some great nuggets in there, some great stories, so thank you for that. So there's more to come. You must have some questions on that, because I've got some questions already. So please get your questions into the interface, and we'll deal with them coming up shortly. So whatever question you got, something you query, why did you do it that way? Did you think about this? Get the questions in now. This is the best way to share this expertise. So let's just talk a little bit, take this whole value thing a step forward. When you think about what I discussed at the outset and what Steve's talked through, we've got to think about moving from this idea of cost reduction to value creation, that reputation. Now, clearly, cost reduction has a value, both within shared services, GBS, and beyond. And we've talked about that. But also, we've got to think about value in terms of what we deliver and perhaps how we measure ourselves in terms of impact on the consumer and the economic customers I talked about earlier, impact on the product we deliver to our consumers, impact on people, impact on brand. And I do like this set of quotes, which I think is a nice thing to think about how we deliver services, is it should be Apple easy, or aspiration should be Apple easy, Google fast, and Amazon customer centric. And I know Hackett Group use that a lot, and I really like that. So I think that's worth thinking about value in that context. And Steve's talked a lot about this whole issue of the process focus. And this is, everyone's doing an element of end-to-end process focus, but we all know it's challenging. And Steve talked about some of the challenges he had. And one of the things that keeps coming up time and time again is, we're used to hiring functional experts who are good in the tunnel. They're good in that left-hand picture. They really know their way up and down that single line in the maze. But if we're going to get end-to-end, enterprise scale business focus, then we've got to get to these bigger pictures to get the helicopter view about what are we actually trying to achieve. And you need specialists with also a generalist viewpoint and the ability to collaborate, that Steve talked. And we got to develop the capability and skills. But to me, there's kind of a maturity model here. You've got to be able to have the engagement. I mean, just having the engagement with the business unit leaders and the functional heads out in the business, that in itself is a key ask for many organizations. And then make sure there's effective communication. And then once there's communication, make sure there's some understanding, a shared understanding, which can lead then to collaboration, where we're doing things together, and a shared vision, and ultimately coordinated execution between shared services, GBS, the functions, and the business units. Now, if you can do all of that, and you don't, at the end of it, and you still don't have ownership of the process, I wouldn't worry, because we've achieved our ambition. And maybe one of the mistakes we're making is focusing too much on the ownership question and not enough on those steps through. How do we make sure we can deliver those things? So I think that's something for us to think about, and Steve's shared some good thoughts there. And when we think about the people we need, we're very good at, as I said, we get functional experts who are good in the tunnel. We got very good managers, and the management skills of planning and budgeting, organization, staffing, problem solving, doing what we know well. That's a recognized business skill. The leadership skills in terms of motivating, establishing direction, sort of understanding, really digging out the essence of fact and opinion, exploring and creating. These are this process leadership, process collaboration, process ownership skills. Now, it's a challenge to find both these mindsets in the same person, and that's not a problem. You can have, we hire complementary skills, that's fine. But it's worth thinking about this, and this is well documented in John Kotter's work. He talks about the dual operating system, and he's a renowned management thinker. And it's worth thinking about those skills you have. People are really good at managing and execution, people about leading and vision creation. And usually, I used to regard these as people on the left are starter finishers, and people on the right are starters. And that's okay, provided you got the balance. And I think it's worth thinking about that. So as we go through this, I've got one more poll for you. In fact, I've got two more polls for you. But when you look at your shift to value creation, or moving away from just being perceived as a cost reducer, what is the biggest challenge or the biggest inhibitor to your transformation in that reputation? Is it reputation of yourselves in the business? Number one. Is it the end-to-end process understanding and alignment, as we've talked about quite a lot? Is it the complexity of the current business process and IT landscape? Is it the availability of data insight to drive that collaboration and meaningful conversation up and down the process? Or is it the talent and skills? And I've used this kind of phrase about technique, intelligence, pace, personality, those things that you need to be able to really affect these outcomes. So have a think about what is the biggest challenge. So it's, this is getting a little bit harder to think through, but of those five, is it reputation? Is it end-to-end process understanding deep into the business and out to the consumer and the supplier and business partners? Is it complexity of process and landscape? Is it availability of data to really understand what's going on in the engine when the oil lights go on? Or is it talent and skills? So 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's have a look and see what you say. So end-to-end process. So nearly half of you see end-to-end process. Well, that's consistent, certainly, with Steve's conversations. And complexity is always a big issue. Data is big for some. So based on your sense, most of you feel you got the talent and skills. So that's great. And reputation is impactable. That's useful insight. Thank you. So you can't talk about driving value, and you can't talk about the progress of shared services and GBS without talking about intelligent automation. Where's the value component in that? We talk a lot about process. Surely automation, robotics, AI have a big impact here. So, you can't help, realize there's lots of surveys that tell us the technologies are a high priority in terms of investment for organizations. We know that organizations are investing highly in these, and that's good news. We need to exploit what's possible. And RPA is the topical technology currently about how to rapidly deploy productivity enhancements. And I think it's important for those of you that are experiencing this, you'll know this very well. For those of you who are early on the journey or considering the journey, definitely take advantage of RPA for the right tasks. It is actually about task automation, not process automation, which is a key point. So perhaps it should be called RTA. But there's some big efficiency gains to be had. You can see the bullets here. I don't need to read through. I think the key point is it's about integrating applications and integrating tasks, which currently people have to be part of. And that key point about eliminating frustrating tasks from valuable people is a much more important topic than we first thought, because the people we're bringing into the workplace now, the entry-level people, do not want to be doing the stuff that we had to do when we first started work. So it's a pretty important topic, and it could even be an existential threat for some organizations. So those are big things. So that's great news. The bit at the bottom is about taking care. So we get, sometimes get excited about task productivity increases, which are massive. When you look at an end-to-end process, sometimes these things are not very significant. There's some control and oversight issues which we have, whatever form of automation we have. I think there's a whole discussion around this. I think the bits I'd like to kind of focus on are you know, if you've got bad processes or tasks that don't quite make sense, automate them just makes bad worse faster. And that's a Walmart comment, and I love it. And you know, that if you had to remember one thing, that'd be it. The other piece is when you're looking at processes, eliminate the stuff that doesn't add value before you automate it. And that is, again, a massive impact. And a lot of the productivity increases come from those eliminations. So it's important to think about that. So we've got RPA, that's going well, but already people are asking, so what's next? It's not going to change the world. So people are talking about cognitive automation and all the rest of it. And artificial intelligence has a number of streams. I'm not going to go into it, don't worry, we're not going to be going into this, but I want to talk a little bit about machine learning. It's probably the most popular and one of the most relevant global centralized business processes like shared services and GBS support. We'll talk about machine learning. Now, rather than explain what it is, which is about, you know, software that learns from large volumes of data rather than programmatic instructions, there's a really good example here, which I think raises both questions and answers for us. So some smart data scientists looking at machine learning, applying it in the real world, said, like, how can we demonstrate the value of this? So they looked at some real world problems like cancer diagnosis. So if you have a cancer scare, you get a blood test, get a drop of blood on a slide, and an expert pathologist will put that under a high resolution microscope, and they will examine to see if they can see cancer cells. It's a manual expert task. So a smart person said, well, all images are digitizable. Let's digitize hundreds of thousands of images. Let's run data. Let's put machine learning algorithms together. Let's learn and work out if we can make machine learning identify cancer. So they built this AI classifier, this algorithm, machine learning algorithm, and it found 92.5% of cases, which is amazing. Right? So without human intervention, 92.5% of cases, that's an amazing result. Of course, the downside is they said, well, actually, the human pathologist gets 96.5%, and when it's life and death, you'd rather go that way. So at the point where everyone thought, okay, so technology is good, but not good enough, the smartest person in the room said, well, hang on, look at the data. When the AI is supporting humans, you get the best result, 99.5% success rate if you've got expert humans supported by the AI, but supported by machine learning. And the reason for that is, which may not be a surprise to you, but humans are really good at identifying false positives. And the classifier is very good at identifying those really edge cases because it's just looking at the data. It's not being influenced by anything. So put those two together and you get really good decisions. And this is a really important factor for us as we look at driving value and driving automation, optimization in all business processes, including in shared services and GBS. So this whole idea about artificial intelligence gets a little bit confused with some of the articles you read. I don't believe it's a doomsday scenario. It does help us with data-driven decision-making. It's not going to make the decisions for us. It's going to present us a much sharper vision, a more precise vision of the decision we need to take, as is the case there. And it's teaching us that effectiveness is every bit as value-creating as efficiency. And there's a whole TED Talk, and TED Talks are brief, but it's about 8 minutes, and my co-founder Tom Gruber has got a great talk on this. You should get on, just search on Google, how AI can enhance our memory, work, and social lives. He goes into a lot more detail, but it's only 8 minutes. If you're interested in this, I do suggest you look at it because it's a critical point. But what we're learning is there's efficiency, best execution of transactions, as effectiveness about making sure we make the best decisions. And in business now and in the future, we need both of those. We need that balancing act. So that's kind of pretty important. And if you can look at that, if you start getting closer to what we do in GBS and shared services, really you've got tasks and transactions. So whether that's driven by ERP, process suites, RPA, whatever, and you've got best decisions, which is going to be enabled by better data insights. So we need to get both of those things supported in our business. So what we're learning from the experience, and Steve's talked a little bit about this as well, is this whole thing about, you know, KPIs are great, that's wonderful, but to be able to get that insight into what's really, why do we have low oil, and how do we know about it before it goes red, and how can we really see the process execution? I come back to these skills. That information, you need that information to be able to develop along these capabilities. So to be able to engage effectively and communicate effectively and understand, you need to have some data, because we're talking about complex machinery of business. And what we're seeing is a great link here between using the data on the right, both KPIs and detailed information beneath it about exceptions and defects. And that allows us to have the discussion, the unemotional discussion about building a shared vision and coordinated execution to drive performance improvement and value creation. So final question for you. So if you look at this whole issue of global process alignment, process leadership, process ownership, what do you think in your organization are the most significant performance improvement areas? And this, you can select as many as you want, but I suggest 2 or 3 maximum probably. Do you think it's the capability and skills in shared services at GBS that is your biggest improvement area? Is it your ability to engage with the business across the end-to-end process? Is it your understanding of the business unit needs, opinions, and operating differences? Is it metrics and KPIs, their usefulness and timeliness, or is it detailed process execution data? And have a think about that, because it's helpful to think about how this applies to our own real-world situation. So you've got 10 seconds, or a few seconds anyway. So is it the capability and skills? Is it business engagement across the end-to-end process? Is it understanding of business unit needs, the varying business unit needs, opinions, and operating differences? Is it metrics and KPIs and how useful and timely they are? Or is it the detailed process data? So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You can choose 2 or 3 if you want. It's not a single choice. So let's have a look what we got here. So, okay, so the business engagement on the end-to-end process and understanding of business units, which kind of related. Okay, that's really useful. So thank you. I'm conscious of times. I'm going to move on, but we're going to share this back with you. So don't worry about that. You're going to get this, this data. It's anonymous, so you don't need to worry about it. So moving from cost to value, we talked at the outset, is about convenience and intimacy. The new world is about convenience and intimacy. It's about the consumer. And the consumer cares about speed, quality, reliability, and cost, but not of each interaction, but of the outcome. And then in shared services and GBS, what can we do to enable that? We've got to think about the consumer, the stakeholder, the user experience. We've got to think about end-to-end process alignment, and Steve talked very eloquently about that. We've got to think about end-to-end process automation for best execution using a combination of technologies. And we've got to think about end-to-end process data support for best decisions. And we've got to think about skills and talent, particularly around this topic of business partnering, engaging. So these are really the issues of the day. And one kind of point that as you look forward, there's some discussion being held that maybe the future of shared services, the future of GBS, maybe the future of business is going to be modeled on the kind of the platform-based business of some of the Silicon Valley behemoths. So this idea, and obviously in a business which is both digital and physical, this can be complex, but this idea that rather than a design, build, operate model, we have 3 streams of activity. So everything to do with design, build, and operate the process to do with customer experience and customer journey is in one group. Everything we do is design, build, and operate around the end-to-end process, business capability, is in another group. And everything to do with the hardcore IT capabilities, such as databases, cloud services, identity and access management, all that stuff, is in another group. Design, build, and operate. And this idea of mission control is the ultimate global process owner that provides oversight, coordinates, allocates resources, allocates money, sets priorities, and sets standards. And therefore, you're going to see if this comes to pass, and it is happening in some businesses, then this idea of the future global process owner is actually going to be running large chunks of the business. So if we get this right, there's a great opportunity. There's a few hurdles to go along the way. So a few things to consider as we come to conclude. How do we become agile? Are we really as global process engaged and aligned as we'd like to think? How do we get this effective stakeholder collaboration? These are the discussions that we've been having and working with clients for a number of years now. Steve's really articulated this well. What's the focus of our automation efforts? Are we putting the automation in the right place? Are we getting the necessary data, necessary insights? Are we developing the talent we need? And I like this comment because we all like to believe there's some kind of silver bullet, but there isn't. And this guy was a Nobel Prize winner. It's about aggregation and marginal gains. So we have time for 1 or 2 quick questions. If you haven't asked any questions yet, but you've got some, just send an email now to this email address. That's my email, and we'll respond to you anyway. But we're going to give you a couple of questions before we close off. So let's see what first we've got. So I'm going to give this one to Steve. So how did he justify hiring at higher salaries than the business case allowed? Steve, you talked about making some decisions driven by the business case. Do you want to say a few words about that?
Yeah, of course. So thanks for the question. It goes back to this idea of kind of pay me now or pay me later, and so the main focus we had on this was we were hiring above cost for some of our key roles in the center, and made the case that first of all, if we do this again, if we hire this role again in 6 months or 12 months, obviously the numbers explain themselves. But the other area we really focused on was this was going to allow us to integrate and transition quicker and more effectively, and that the net business goodness relative to, or in our example, was on the DSO side, was going to allow us to provide a better outcome for the business, and a half a day of DSO, over the course of a quarter for our company greatly outweighed the additional cost for this role for that period.
That's great. Thanks, Steve. We do have a number of other questions. I am conscious of time. We are now up to our time slots. We have some great questions here. We'll respond to you individually by email. If you have some more questions you haven't asked, if they're already on the system, don't worry, we'll respond. If you've got questions you haven't asked, just ping me an email at d@consider.biz. It's been a delight having you here, and some of you have been up very late at night, so appreciate that. Some of you got up especially early this morning. So thank you all, and thank you very much to Steve Fox, our guest expert, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much indeed.